Thanksgiving. Once you've had your coffee, there will be a short comfort break, but we do want to get on with the proceedings.
It's only short.
They never come.
Andrew and I were contemporaries in university. There was no. Andrew and I.
That we welcome Professor Christopher Andrew, who's come all the way from Cambridge. His research interests are 20th century political history and international relations, with particular reference to the role and influence of intelligence agencies. He is also, of course, the official historian of MI5. And today, this evening, he's going to talk, as you've seen on your program, the secret special relationship, the history of British-American intelligence alliance. Professor Christopher, thank you very much indeed for coming, and over to you.
Thank you for coming, and you're unlikely, I believe, to see a more wholesome Thanksgiving picture than that one. So, and also, I think this is the only occasion where we have drunk the hell those two images which I've shown on the screen. So what you can see is Obama is passing on a secret to Her Majesty. Many times. One text we've forgotten about Queen Elizabeth II is that over the last 60 plus years, she has heard more secrets than anybody else anywhere in the world. When she gets the number one copy of the Joint Intelligence Committee. So there is no politician in the country who's heard secrets, top secrets, for as long as she has. It can, as you can see from the expression on her face, become boring after. Let me take you back 100 years. These are the heads of state 100 years ago. The brightest person, certainly the best educated person ever to become president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who became president in 1913. The last head president of a major university who will ever become president of the United States. Just admitting you were a really academic would be enough to prevent you from standing, I think, for the next election. So he's the best educated American who ever became head of state. And there's no doubt at all that George V was the least well educated. I would about to say he did try, but that's an exaggeration. There's no evidence that he tried whatever. And yet, he knew something that the man who was to his left, his right and our left, very much right of him, didn't realise. George V was the first monarch of the 20th century to realise that in order to win wars, you actually need to have good intelligence. So he produced this, what looks like platitudinous statement. Nobody else was saying it at the time. The spy is the greatest of all soldiers, that is why the enemy fears him as much. Woodrow Wilson, this is a period when, if you were interested in the spies, it just meant you were reading spy stories. So he's much too intelligent, he thought, to be interested in intelligence. And this is what he said after World War I. He actually boasted about the fact. He didn't say I was wrong not to know anything or be interested in it. He just boasted about the fact that he knew nothing. Let me testify to this, my fellow citizens. I not only did not know it until we got into this war, but didn't believe it when I was told it was true. That Germany was not the only country that maintained a secret service. So the capacity of exceptionally intelligent people to be exceptionally stupid, I think is not sufficiently recognised by historians. And because, you're lucky, I don't want to knock the media too much. I don't know why I don't want to knock the media too much. I don't think I can argue with it, but the WikiLeaks stories have plumbed new depths, as far as I'm concerned, of historical ignorance. Where did WikiLeaks begin? They began in the State Department. I have a brilliant American PhD student. Actually, I have a series of brilliant American PhD students who are working on it at the moment. All that WikiLeaks has been doing, and by the way, I don't hold it, is exactly what the State Department used to do until the First World War. what the State Department used to do to the First World War, at the moment when the President gave his address on the State of the Union, and by the way, we tend to assume that presidents have always spoken to Congress. No, they didn't. Woodrow Wilson was the first person to actually do it. The others just sent messages. And what did the Secretary of State do? He published at the same time, this is just one example, a collection of the most interesting dispatches sent by American envoys around the world during the previous year. And this is just one example. The New York Times actually complained about the indiscretion of the Secretary of State. Oh my goodness, what a turnaround that has been. So the United States, wasn't going to get involved in the wickedness of the old world. So it didn't have its spies before the First World War. It didn't even have an organization to investigate our spies. It had the Bureau of Investigation, later the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but didn't do anything with counter-espionage. Because we had a war coming with Germany, Sir Vernon Kell, head of MI5, had identified all significant German spies before and during World War I, which is why what Tetsu forget. German spies were, this is not an exaggeration, 100 times more successful in the United States during World War I than in Britain in the United States. The biggest bang in and around New York before the destruction of the World Trade Center was when they blew up this huge depot of munitions in Black Tom Island in 1916. So how does this extraordinary relationship between the best country in intelligence and the worst country in intelligence, which precisely describes the British East Americans, the outbreak of First World War, begin? Well, because we have a lot of cultural affinity. That's too difficult a concept to deal with in the brief time available. But here's something I think that just about everybody in the room knows about. If you don't know about it, well, I can recommend as a Christmas present, even more than my own book on MI5, because Ben McIntyre's books are shorter. The ones on the double cross system. During the Second World War, every single, by which I mean 100%, not a mere 99%, every single German spy who was landed in Britain was caught, and the best of them were turned into double agents and passed on disinformation to the Germans, which made possible the D-Day landings and various other things. But what even Ben doesn't mention is that it begins in the First World War. But who are the people we're recruiting in the First World War? Americans. Why? Because the United States, in a fit of absent-mindedness, does not enter the First World War until April 1917. This means that for almost 3 years, Americans can travel through Germany and volunteer to become German agents. And then they come to us and say, would you like us to be British agents instead? And we say yes. So I've given a couple of examples, which you'll find in more detail in my Penguin history of MI5. The first shows why we are better at recruiting foreign agents than anybody else anywhere in the world. And that is because unless they give their permission, we don't identify them. I know who Como was, but I'm not going to tell you. I didn't put it in the book, and nobody is ever going to know. So there's an American who was a superb double agent. The Germans thought he was working for them. He was working for us. He didn't want his identity to be revealed, and 100 years later, it isn't revealed. And in 200 years' time, it won't be revealed. The only reason why, and I've given the other example, Rosalind Woodhook, is that Rosalind Woodhook was so proud of being a British double agent, he admitted it. Now, he identifies exactly those social skills that we look for in Americans who are prepared to work for British intelligence. Well, they're allies, so we don't do it any longer. But Rosalind Woodhook, as it says on the screen, was a former newspaper editor in St. Louis. He went through an extremely messy divorce, which is described in the New York Times. You can find it on a website near you. And his wife, during the divorce proceedings, describes how he had had an affair with the leading fashion model in St. Louis. And the husband of the fashion model had come to St. Louis, and I quote her words, to kill my husband, end quote. But she explained that, you know, as soon as he arrived, Rosalind Whittock made friends with him. They got on extremely well, and they soon became buddies. Now, what British intelligence is looking for is people with those sort of social skills. The second reason, an awful lot of things depend on the American ambassador. Exactly 100 years ago, this man, Walter Hines Page, probably against strong competition, the biggest Anglophile ever to become the US ambassador in London, was appointed to London by Woodrow Wilson. What does he say during World War I? Let's get together with British intelligence. Why? Because he meets some of the most extraordinary people, and there isn't any kind of exaggeration, who have ever taken part in intelligence. Now, the leading British intelligence officer in World War I is this man, Captain Reginald, later Admiral, Reginald Blinker Hall. These are the days in which all boys who had been through independent schools were given nicknames, and he blinked a lot, so he was called Blinker Hall. But what Page wrote back to Wilson about the effective head of British intelligence in World War I is absolutely extraordinary. Neither in fiction nor in fact can you find any such man to match him. The man is a genius, a clear case of genius. All other Secret Service men are amateurs by comparison. Hall can look through you and see the very muscular movements of your immortal soul. Is this love? Well, you know, whatever it is, at no point since in British-American relations has any American said such extraordinary things about any Britain. There have been some pretty extraordinary things. So why does he say that Blinker Hall is so extraordinary? Because Blinker Hall leads the best code-breaking group in the world. Well, we all know about Bletchley Park, but it's going on in World War I as well. And as the Germans have pretty simple codes in World War I, actually it's easier to break German codes in World War I than World War II. The next time you pass down Whitehall, it's about a third. If you're coming from Trafalgar Square, the Admiralty Old Building is about a third of the way down on your right-hand side. And what what Dr. Page notices, for the first time, he realizes that this is part of what, you know, I wouldn't say this if it wasn't a British audience. We are better and have been better at any other culture in world history, sometimes, of making use of eccentrics. We're the first people to realize that even if clever people are mostly round the bend, it doesn't mean that we can't really make use of it. You know, there won't unfortunately be time for questions because we're running late, but I would invite anybody to mention another culture that's done that. So what does he say? There are most uncommon creatures amongst them. Well, this is the best code breaker of World War I, at King's Cambridge, the classicist Dilly Knox. Why? Well, you see, within British culture, you can do sensible things which look like absurd things bureaucratically. So why is he so good at code breaking? Because when he gets a really difficult thing to do, he goes to have a bath. Well, think about it. I mean, lying, soaking in a bath, your mind is relaxed in a way that it is not when you're looking at your word processor. And nowadays, you know, I fear for students, because there are no baths left in British universities. They have showers. You cannot think, try it, with all this water pounding. This is why the British people were more intelligent in the First World War than they are today. More baths, fewer showers. So, somebody else from King's College, Cambridge, Frank Burt. Yeah, and again, it happened nowadays in Bristol or in Cambridge. Frank Burt, Director of Studies in History at King's College, Cambridge. He used to play in the Palladium during the pantomime season. He's supposed to have given the definitive performance of the Widow Twankey in Aladdin. And this is what he says about Dilly Knox. The bathroom, by the way, in the Admiralty was room 53. The sailor room, room 53, has never, it's true, been to sea, but though not in a boat, he's yet set afloat in a bath in the Admiralty. It's not a very good But just imagine somebody coming to the Kaiser and saying, there is somebody in a bathroom in the German Admiralty who is breaking British codes. Not a chance. Now, what was the thing that most impressed the Americans? Because we broke the code in which a really important message sent by the intellectually and in all kinds of other ways challenged German Foreign Minister Alfred Zimmermann, sent early in 1917, just as the Americans were beginning to get round to joining the First World War. That's what it looked like in cipher form. That's what it looked like after Room 40 had decrypted it. What did it say? What it said to the Mexicans is, look, we look pretty likely to join the war, and why don't you join in as well? And you can have any bits of the United States that you like. How about starting off with Texas and New Mexico and a few other places? So we knew that if we gave that to the Americans, they would be annoyed. Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour calls the moment when he hands that decrypted telegraph page, quote, the most dramatic in all time. And Wilson, on the 2nd of April 1917, when he announces the United States is entering the First World War, the United States would have entered the First World War later anyway, but it would not have entered it as a united nation. Having the intelligence evidence of what the Germans were up to means that only one person votes against it. So it changes the timing, changes the nature. The United States is at war, but there are some things which we don't tell the Americans. And this is before Foggy Bottom existed. This is where the State Department used to hang out in 1917. And, I couldn't break many codes, but I wouldn't have any difficulty with State Department codes as they existed in the First World War. Neither would my 6-year-old grandson. And, he's quite a bright lad, but not exceptionally bright, but certainly good enough to deal with American codes as they existed at that period. Now, Wilson realized that, so he had an unbreakable code devised for himself and for the man on the right, Colonel House, who was his chief foreign policy advisor. As Colonel House went round the courts of Europe trying to work out whether there was any possibility of a compromise deal. And there's his wife, who also had to spend many hours of many nights putting these messages into cipher and then deciphering them, and as you see, he doesn't look very pleased about the whole thing. I haven't got time to go through the whole of the code, but the code word for Secretary of War was Mars, and you may be able to work out what Neptune meant. So the happiest hours spent by British code breakers in the First World War, sorry I'm exaggerating, the happiest minutes spent by British code breakers in the First World War were decrypting the top secret messages of the President of the United States. And Sir Maurice Hankey, Cabinet Secretary for 22 years, nobody's going to do that again. Calls them invaluable because we can tell how close the Americans are getting to joining in the war. Now, nobody had told Lloyd George that if you were breaking somebody's codes, you weren't supposed to tell them. So he tells Dr. Page, this is discovered in his papers by another brilliant American PhD student of mine. He is brilliant as well, just like the others. He said, I want you to know how much I enjoy reading your dispatches to Washington. Well, Page was not enormously intellectually gifted, but he realized that something must have gone wrong. But of course, what he thought was that the richest State Department was leaking. It never occurred to him that we were breaking his science. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Now, the other person that we really fooled during the First World War, here's the problem. I mean, we were sincere friends of the United States, but Britain was not going to survive unless we got the United States into World War I and then into World War II. So we would stop at nothing. And if it meant fooling the President of the United States, present or future, well, we'd do it. Well, the President during the Second World War, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this is before he had polio, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but in charge of naval intelligence. He comes over to Britain. That's his statue, by the way, in Grosvenor Gardens, from where the American Embassy is going to move before too long. Hall has a wonderful intelligence service. And Hall tells Roosevelt, who was an innocent, how we're getting all this intelligence. He says that British spies crossed the German-Danish border each night. They never crossed it a single night, by the island of Silk, to which they never went. And then they got every day on a flying boat. That's what a flying boat looked like during the First World War for Harwich. And he tells Roosevelt this. And Roosevelt not merely believes it, but when the Director of Naval Intelligence early in the Second World War goes to see Roosevelt in the White House, Admiral John Godfrey, the man on the left, he discovers absolute amazement that not merely had Roosevelt bought this complete fiction in World War I, he still believed it in World War II. It's one of the reasons why he was so willing to do an intelligence alliance with us. How do things begin to get better, and how do we begin to get a bit more honest? Well, you know, one of the reasons we win the First and Second World War is utterly straightforward. The Neville Chamberlain, the worst Prime Minister in British history, is succeeded in May 1940 by the best Prime Minister in British history. He also understands intelligence well. But we're so anxious to get Roosevelt into the Second World War that, you know, there are no Zimmerman telegrams around, so we start making things up. And here's one. 27th of October 1941, President Roosevelt broadcast this to the American people. You can find it in presidential papers. I have in my possession a secret map made in Germany by Hitler's government, by planners of the New World Order. That's the map. They have divided South America into 5 vassal states, bringing the whole continent under their domination. This map, my friends, makes clear the Nazi design not only against South America, but against the United States as well. Oh, no, it didn't. He's British. Fortunate. And he's the head of MI6 in the United States, who is also head of British Security Coordination, Sir William Stevenson, who forges it. But the United States is so grateful for the forgeries provided by William Stevenson that after World War II, there he is, he becomes the first non-American to receive the US medal for, in my view, we should give it back, but I don't think that's great. So when do we start being honest with the United States? I mean, we're honest in one sense all the time, that the friendship was entirely genuine. It's simply that we don't start being honest with them until the 8th of December 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. And from that moment until this, I do not think, and I can't go through the evidence, but I've got evidence for it, we have told them a single falsehood. And they haven't told us many either, but they're entitled to get their own back a little bit. So what happens on the 7th of December 1941? Well, as you know, Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack on the US Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, which brings the United States into the war, happens very early in the morning, but because of the time difference, it's early evening British time. Churchill is in Chequers when Pearl Harbor takes place. And by chance, he has Roosevelt's special envoy on the left, Averell Harriman, and on the right, the US ambassador, John Wynant. And they're chattering so much, as we have done tonight. You know, if the radio had been on in the background, we wouldn't really have caught the fact that Cameron has just resigned and been succeeded by Ed Miliband. No, he hasn't. We wouldn't have heard it anyway. So they hear that something funny has been going on in Hawaii. But they don't hear quite what he hears. So Churchill calls in his butler, who's called Sawyers. And he said, Sawyers, what was on the 9 o'clock news on Home Service, as it was called in those days? And Sawyer says, it is quite true, sir. The Japanese have attacked the US Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. Now, I believe only in a British country house can the news of World War be brought by the butler. That is what's happened. And then what happens? I can't grasp all this, but Dwight D. Eisenhower, the greatest general in the United States history, and I will give some evidence for that, with the possible exception of George Washington. Roosevelt, when he's briefing him, doesn't think to mention about Ultra. Churchill gets him down to Chequers and briefs him as soon as he's arrived. I remember in 1942, he arrives as Commander-in-Chief of US forces in the European theatre. It's not until later that he becomes, 2 years later almost, that he becomes Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces in Europe. And then he does something which no general, and forgive me for repeating this phrase, but so much about British-American relations has never happened ever before anywhere else in the history of the world. And for the first time in the history of the world, the general in one country chooses as his intelligence chief, his G2, a general from another country. And this is General Sir Kenneth Strong, who was a classic exponent of the British stiff upper lip in the days when we still had stiff upper lips. And when he was asked at the end of the Second World War what it was like being Eisenhower's intelligence chief, his top lip begins to quiver. And he says this, which I think precisely describes my experience of going to the United States, and I think many people here, that the best time in a man's life is when he gets to like Americans. And what makes the most difference? Bletchley Park. And Bletchley Park, for the first time, once again, forgive my repetition of the phrase, but it's important, for the first time in world history, code breakers from one country come to work with code breakers from another country. Those the Americans arrive at Bletchley Park. And at the end of the war, Eisenhower says, Bletchley Park's been of priceless value to me, saved thousands of British and American lives, and so it did. Meanwhile, the Americans had not got round until the Second World War to establishing a human intelligence service, spies and counter-spies and so on, and OSS. And OSS is given secrets by British intelligence, which no foreign intelligence service had ever been given before by a foreign intelligence service. And in particular, the double agents. And this is the most famous of the double agents, codenamed Garbo, who the Germans believe is working for them, but is in fact working for us and feeds them with disinformation. And so you get, for the first time in the history of the world, in 1944, major awards by two different powers. He gets a bigger award for the people receiving the Iron Cross than he gets from us for, well, it's not a measly MBE, but I still think it's good enough. And without him, we could not possibly have landed in D-Day on the Normandy beaches. Germans, after all, had within reach of the Normandy beaches nearly 60 divisions. We cannot put ashore more than 6 divisions in the first week. And, and so these heroic pictures, the Brits, we refused to allow photographers, and so the only photographs we have are American. Couldn't have happened without the British-American Intelligence Alliance. This is one of the reasons why I do think that Eisenhower is the greatest general of the 20th century. And the reason for this is that he was prepared to recognize when he was taking an extraordinary gamble. And the biggest gamble that he took, and actually the biggest gamble that the British or American general, sensible gamble, took in the entire history of the Second World War, was to land on the Normandy beaches. So after he's briefed the press on the media on the 5th of June, the day before D-Day, and they've gone, they're not going to be able to produce the story until the landing's actually being, he gets a blank sheet of paper on which he writes that. And what he says on that is that I've had to give the order to withdraw our troops from the beaches in northern France, in Normandy. They've achieved everything that bravery and devotion to duty can achieve. The fault is mine alone. The idea that Monty would have blamed himself for anything frightening beyond imagination. So he realized that if it failed, it would be a Dunkirk on a much huger scale, and that he would have to do a press communique. But he was also brave enough to realize that he wouldn't have time to do it when it happened, so he'd better do it beforehand. And he found this in his diary a month later. He's put the date at the bottom, the 5th of July. Yeah. Why it is, I think it's because, despite becoming President of the United States, he's a modest individual. He was the greatest general of the 20th century. So, in the Second World War, even the most unpleasant American intelligence chief of modern times, and I don't think many people would think that's an inaccurate description of J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover, when he saw a good thing, and he'd get some publicity out of it, sooner or later would go into it. So, the MI5 gave the FBI a small role in the double-cross system. And this is the point at which we will connect with a moment with something that is well known to everybody in the room, but maybe nobody else has connected it with this individual. So the FBI man who was given a double agent to run is Mark Phillip. He's a little bit unlike people in MI5, because nobody in MI5 is allowed to carry weapons, we're not allowed to arrest anybody, but as you see, Mark Felt liked, I don't know which Western he's imitating, but as you can see, he liked brandishing a gun when a photographer came up and said, "May I take a photograph of you?" Now, a generation later, this connects with something that we all remember, the biggest scandal in modern American political history. So there's Nixon on the left, and there's Hoover on the right. Hoover remained head of the FBI for 50 years, longer than any American has ever remained head of anything within the federal government. And when he dies in 1972, Mark Felt, a man who had run formations with MI5, does not become Hoover's successor, but he becomes the number 2. And he, in other words, lives through the period that I think everybody in this room is old enough to remember, the most influential whistleblowing in US history. Snowden is not in the same class when it comes to whistleblowing. This is Watergate. And Watergate, of course, leads to the resignation of Richard Nixon. And the biggest media scoop in modern American history is achieved by these two people. I think everybody in the room will remember. The Washington Post reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. And they have this secret source who they refuse to identify, quite rightly, Deep Throat. Who's Deep Throat? Deep Throat, as he admits before his death, is Mark Felt, the man who had learnt his trade working with MI5 in World War II. There he is admitting it, and there he is admitting it again. I am the guy they call Deep Throat. Now, I'm going to have to abbreviate things at a bit of this point, because we're running a bit behind, not surprisingly, because we've all had an extremely good meal and spent an appropriate amount of time enjoying a really good meal. So, moving on to the currently most contentious aspect of the secret intelligence alliance between Britain and the United States is this, as we were discussing a little bit at our table. What we tend not to realize is the connection between our own personal friendships and the friendship between Britain and the United States. Now, there is a tremendously easy way of identifying the closest friends of everybody in this room, including myself, and it's this, and I'm not going to ask the question. But if I was to ask the question of anybody in this room, who do you share most confidences with? The names that you would give would define absolutely precisely who your closest friends are. And the same happens in international relations. Which country do you share most secrets with? And the answer is that Britain and the United States have shared, do share, and will continue to share more secrets than, forgive the use of the phrase, but it's such an extraordinary relationship that it bears repeating, more than any other two powers in the history of the world. And the origins of that are the experience of World War II, the honest collaboration rather than the British deception of World War I and the beginning of World War II. And in particular, Bletchley Park, the code-breaking alliance, the signals intelligence alliance. So there's Harry Truman. Nobody has told him about Bletchley Park until 6 months earlier, immediately after he becomes president. Then he suddenly realizes how much Ultra has contributed to shortening the war against Germany and also shortening the war against Japan. So on the 12th of September 1945, and none of his biographers mention it, but it's all there in the archive, he says this: the Secretary of War and the Secretary of Navy are hereby authorized to continue collaboration in the field of communication intelligence, interception, code breaking between the United States Army and Navy and the British, and to extend, modify, or discontinue this collaboration is determined to be in the best interests of the United States. And that is precisely what The Guardian has been on about recently. How did it begin? One of the other extraordinary things about the British-American relationship is that amongst the people who have formed it have people who have been profoundly intelligent and patriotic people who've been so eccentric that no other country would have given them a look at. But also the age. Look at the man on the left, Harry Hinsley. Harry Hinsley was recruited to Bletchley Park at the age of 21 after he had finished only 2 years of his Cambridge history degree in 1939. He never did get to finish his Cambridge history degree, but that didn't prevent him becoming Master of St John's College, Vice Chancellor, and a number of other things. You can search the history of the world in vain for another student who achieved as much as he did with such slender paper qualifications. So, 1946, after Truman has signed the authorization, he comes on and works out the details of an alliance which still exists. It's called the Okusa Agreement, top secret until 2010. And there are two ways of looking at it. The one is Edward Snowden. I can't allow the US government to destroy privacy and basic liberties. And the other one is William Hague. We should have nothing but pride in the unique and indispensable intelligence sharing relationship between Britain and the United States. There is, they may be wrong, but there isn't a single living British Foreign Secretary of any party, or a single living British Home Secretary who's responsible for MI5 who disagrees with that view. The Guardian claims it's going to explain when it gives evidence, the Rossbridger gives evidence in a fortnight's time, how it has discovered what it is that it can release from the Snowden material which will not damage British national interests from material that it will not release and will. This will be a truly extraordinary moment, and I believe it will, I'm an exact contemporary of the founders of Monty Python, and I believe that this will be a Monty Python moment in the history of the British-American special relationship. Now, what do they discover? The first great thing that Code-Breaking Alliance discovers is that something unfortunate was going on at Cambridge University. I choose my words with unnecessary delicacy. I mean, the many universities represented in this room, and every single university represented in this room, sent people, some of its people, into intelligence. But if you did come from Cambridge, I think you'll find that the people who went from your university into intelligence went into the intelligence services of our own side. There's nothing wrong with that. It's simply that Cambridge Alliance has had a more cosmopolitan approach. They're the five, so there we are. The five best agents that the Russians ever had abroad, and by the way, that's their view and not simply mine. And we wouldn't have got onto them without that Code-Breaking Alliance. Admittedly, it took us some time to grasp what was going on. So there's Kim Philby of Trinity College, the KGB, and MI6. H. Washington, in other words, head of the Moscow station, from 1949 to 1951. Now, because Russian foreign intelligence is so pathetic nowadays, the only things that they celebrate are the old ones. So, there we are, December 2010, Mikhail Fragkov, the current head of Russian foreign intelligence. He's the man on the right, unveiling a memorial to Kim Philby. That's the plaque in there in the middle that shows Kim Philby looking in two directions. The last is in the middle. And the Putin's deputy on the left. So, I'm just going to state a problem, and there's, I think, not time for me to go on for any significant amount of time afterwards, although having said that, I will go on for a little bit longer, and I know that nice man who's waiting in the car outside will wait a little bit longer. The idea that we could have prevented a 9/11 in Britain, which has been attempted on a bigger scale, without the American-British Code-Breaking Alliance is just cloud cuckoo land. There's just time to, no, there isn't time to mention that, but there is time to mention this. Everybody in this room has memories of the most dangerous moment in British history. Also the most dangerous moment in American history. No doubt it was. The Cuban Missile Crisis 51 years ago. And we were, many of us, really quite surprised to survive that. And we were quite right to be quite surprised. It was actually quite surprising. So why did we survive it? Partly because the Americans had developed something which we didn't. overhead photography from 60,000 feet. This was before the spy satellite. So they discovered before the missile sites in Cuba become operational where they are. But look at these pictures. You wouldn't have been able to work out what they were at had we not had the best agent of the 20th century working on our side. And this is the man, Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, the most important Western agent of the Cold War. But what is truly amazing is that he's run by the British and the United States. In other words, the best peacetime, best Cold War agent we've ever had was run jointly by two separate countries. Again, something which has never happened in the relationship between two other countries. And this is the chief man on the British side, the SIS, MI6 controller Salt Block, Harold Shergold, who comes from my college in Cambridge. And I remember him just before his death taking him to see the portrait of our previous greatest British spy. That's Christopher Marlowe, the contemporary of Shakespeare. You know, by the time he was 29, he'd written better plays than Shakespeare, and he'd also, although you know what would have happened if they'd both lived into their 30s and competed, goodness knows. And so, just before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Penkovsky is able to come with a Soviet delegation to this hotel, which has been redone, and you'd have to pay an awful lot more, and I wouldn't recommend staying in it anyway. Mount Royal, so I call that near Marble Arch. And on the 4th floor is the Soviet delegation, and on the 5th floor are the CIA and collaborating in a way which, to keep using this important phrase, had not happened before. And there's the group. On the left-hand side, there's us, SIS, and you can see Shergold, who's the shorter man in front, and on the right are the Americans. And MI6 never, ever takes photographs of foreign agents being debriefed, interrogated by us. But the Americans did. So one of the CIA came up and took Penkovsky, who's looking away from the camera, to Shergi, who's looking towards us. This is the very, because I'm going to draw a conclusion. This is the last time I'm going to use this phrase. It had never happened before in the history of the world. It never will happen again in the history of the world, and it could not possibly have happened between any two other countries rather than Britain and the United States. Penkovsky knew that he was working for the British and the Americans. He was a colonel, he was a Soviet colonel. So what did he do on this occasion? In order to show where his real loyalties lie, he asks for the Brits and the Americans to bring British and American colonels' uniform. So on the left, you see him dressed as an American colonel, and on the right, you see him dressed as a British colonel. And that, not to put too much an exaggerated point on it, is why we're still alive. Because if we had not been able to interpret the intelligence that we were getting, the United States would have bombed the Cuban missile bases that were being constructed by the Russians, at which point they could have reacted in one and only one of two ways, which was, did we put those missile bases there? Can't tell you how sorry we are. We'll never do that again. Or they might have decided that because we bombed them, they would have bombed us, which would have prevented having this wonderful dinner and evening. Thank you very much.
Richard Boothway to propose a vote of thanks.
I'll come round to the front. Professor Andrew, thank you very much indeed for that this morning. While you were talking, I was thinking that last Friday was 150th year anniversary. And indeed, on that anniversary, a man stood on a hillside in a cemetery giving a 200-word speech. Distinguished gentleman, it was in fact Abraham Lincoln, and he was giving the Gettysburg Address from the Battle of Gettysburg, which was in June, previous June. And my thoughts during this were, I wonder what intelligence he had. I wonder if he really had to fight that war just without any intelligence at all. I guess if he had intelligence, it certainly wasn't reading into the minds of his opposition, as we could see in the First and Second World War. I'm actually quite fascinated with how much this goes on, and it is all, in a way, smoke and mirrors. And I just wonder today what smoke and mirrors are going on, which we shall learn about in 20 years' time. So thank you very much indeed for the time. Thank you very much indeed for a super talk. And thank you for opening one or two more curtains for us. Thank you.
Thanking Professor Christopher, I would also like to say a big thank you to Hannah, our catering lady, who's done a remarkable dinner. Cynthia and Robert Skinner for masterminding the wine so carefully for us. Thank you very much indeed. Tig and Richard for doing the table plans. Richard for magnificently working out how the computer works. And thank you all very much indeed for coming. We wish you a very happy Christmas. Next year we will have a Christmas party, a proper one, but we still think this is rather fun. And as somebody said on our table, first time he's ever been to a Christmas party even before Advent. But thank you very much indeed for coming. Happy Christmas, and we look forward to seeing you all in the new year, some of you possibly becoming a member. Thank you very much.